Welcome, everyone, to Lunch with the Idaho Way. I'm Scott McIntosh, opinion editor for the Idaho Statesman.
And I'm Bryan Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer.
This week, we are talking about school vouchers, otherwise known as education savings accounts.
One of the main bills that was going to be considered this session, Senate Bill 1038, sponsored by Senators Tammy Nichols and Brian Lenny, was voted down by a margin of 12 to 23 on Monday. That was after it failed to gain majority support even within the Republican caucus. There are indications that further bills could be coming, however, and we'll likely see those soon.
Yeah, I think actually three bills got introduced yesterday, new versions of education savings accounts. I interviewed last week Rod Grammer. He's the president of Idaho Business for Education. He's done a lot of research into the experiences of other states who have had education savings accounts. He wrote a guest opinion piece for the Statesman a couple of weeks ago, arguing against these school vouchers. And he's written a pretty in-depth four-part series looking at the experiences of other states such as Wisconsin, Indiana, and Arizona. He testified against the education savings account bill that failed this week in the Senate. And I asked him why he opposed the bill. Here's what he had to say. All right, Rod Grammer, you are president of Idaho Business for Education. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to start with a real general question about vouchers. Your organization and you yourself testified against this ESA bill that's going through the legislature. Just tell me in general, why do you oppose ESAs?
Well, there's several reasons, Scott, but first of all, Idaho is 51st in the country when in the amount that it spends for students. And we can ill afford to start funding 2 or 3 new school systems when we can't even fund the one that we've got adequately. In fact, the Idaho Supreme Court has ruled that we're not in compliance with the Idaho Constitution. And when it comes to supporting public schools in Idaho. And so, I mean, it just doesn't make it defies common sense to say that when you're not funding one school system adequately, you're going to start funding more. The other thing is that from my research, I've learned that, this isn't about moving students from public schools to private schools or religious schools. This is about subsidizing, giving parents who've already chosen private and religious schools a direct government subsidy to send their kids to these other schools. And when did the government ever get in the business of subsidizing, giving direct financial subsidy to people to attend private and religious schools, So, and the other thing is, this really doesn't benefit our rural areas. Very few schools are in rural areas, and our rural schools are already underfunded, even more than our urban schools. I mean, if you look at how much they spend per student, combined with the state appropriation and local support, they are well below the urban schools that have more property tax wealth, because the urban schools basically raise property tax money to help increase the lack of funding that they get from the state. So there are so many reasons to oppose this. I can't think of any good reason to support it.
And I think one of the most compelling arguments for school vouchers has always been helping poor kids get out of so-called failing schools or schools that don't meet their needs. But I've written a couple of columns now based on the experiences of Arizona and Indiana that shows that that's not necessarily exactly what happens with school vouchers in those states. And I asked Rod Grammer about how reality in these states is punching a hole in that theory that vouchers rescue kids from failing schools. Here's what he had to say about that.
The other really striking thing, for years, I thought this was all about helping low income and other students move from public school to private school or religious school. But what I found was that in all these states, 70% of the kids that actually were on vouchers had never attended public schools in the first place. So then I realized that this is not about parental choice, because those parents had already chosen This is really about subsidizing all these families that had already voted with their private school, religious school choice. And so it wasn't really about helping these public school students, move into a better situation.
Yeah, and just a couple of points playing off of that, in the research that I had done, a study in Arizona found that higher income zip codes were overrepresented in applicants to school vouchers, and lower income zip codes were underrepresented in those for those folks who are applying for school vouchers in Arizona. Nearly half of the applicants lived in the wealthiest zip codes in the state. And meanwhile, Rod touched on this a little bit, but on this separate study, nearly 80% of the applicants for school vouchers were not in a public school at the time. And Indiana has similar numbers. They have a really stark statistic. Of the 44,000 students enrolled in private schools and using vouchers in Indiana, only 421 of those students had moved from a so-called failing school. So 421 students out of 44,000, that's less than 1%, really punching a hole in that theory that that vouchers are rescuing students from failing schools. And Brian, I know you've written about objections from homeschoolers. And that was one of on the Senate floor when this bill was defeated. A number of senators had cited objections from homeschoolers. So why would homeschoolers object to vouchers?
Oh, well, to put it in their own words from their website, their position is, quote, we firmly believe that ESAs won't deliver the education freedom they promise and do nothing to protect children from the numerous problems that plague the public school system. They will just bring the same dysfunctional regulations into our homeschools, even those homeschools that don't accept funding. So the concern in the homeschool community for a long time has been that they fought a very long, hard battle to gain true independence from the state. At one time, it was disputed that people had the right to even homeschool their children. And a lot of the people who are very dedicated homeschoolers want true independence from the state. They don't want a lot of oversight. They don't want student testing according to state standards, things like that. And they are worried that ESAs, even though the 1038 didn't include any oversight, they're worried that eventually that oversight will come. And there's some important reasons to believe that they're right about that. Specifically, that has to do with the history of fraud and abuse in places that have implemented ESAs and other voucher systems. There are roughly two forms that this can take. One is fraud from parents who are claiming vouchers. In some states, you've found people buying televisions, people buying Christmas trees, things that have nothing to do with education, using voucher funds. And when taxpayers see that going on, it's not long before they demand some kind of oversight. The bigger problem actually is provider fraud, where schools, especially kind of fly-by-night pop-up private schools, make bids to get a big bunch of voucher money while either providing really bad educational outcomes or just not having the students that they say they have. And once some of that starts happening, especially you can imagine in a homeschool environment where, say, a group of families get together to educate 5 children, well, the state's eventually going to have to verify that there are 5 children, in fact, being educated by this. And this just isn't somebody who's claiming voucher money for these kids. So that's one way in which state oversight of independent homeschools could be a result of an ESA program.
Yeah, and a lot of this push, and I know you've written about this as well. A lot of this push is coming from some of these vendors that would benefit from this. I did a little bit of research from I don't know if you remember the first round of empowering parents. I can't remember the name of it was a $50 million grant. It was kind of like, the camel's nose under the tent. an introduction of ESAs where it was these grants of $1,000 or $1,500 to families, and it was a $50 million grant. Class Wallet, which Tom Luna represents as a lobbyist, he's former state superintendent of public instruction. They got $500,000 out of that just for administering that program, and again, Senator Brian Lenny, in his testimony for the bill, he fell just short of saying the money doesn't go to the families. He doesn't want to say that publicly, but he said, that the money goes to these vendors, and these vendors who sign up with the state, and is rife for the possibility of fraud.
Yeah, and there's been several documented instances of it. There's usually goes when it's provider fraud, it's usually called embezzlement. So if you do a search for voucher embezzlement, you'll find cases all over. Very, very large sums of money, often sometimes by a vendor, sometimes just by an employee of a vendor, but it's all taxpayer money.
Well, and you wrote about this last week about the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. They did a little back of the napkin calculation and said that even though the bill says that the impact is going to be $40 million, really, based on the experience of these other states, the fiscal impact is probably going to be more like $360 million. And you wrote that, hey, once we start talking about $360 million, the state's not going to be able to say, well, we're not going to have any oversight. The state's going to be like, well, no, we gotta be watching this. So again, if those numbers start climbing, taxpayers would demand some sort of oversight and keep an eye on that. But there are apparently some other bills that look like they're coming.
Yeah, so there's three that are floating around out there. One by Representative Winnie Horman and Senator Lori Den Hartog would create basically a tuition grant pilot program. And we've got a rogue cat. So that creates a tuition grant pilot program, more or less. So it's limited in the number of students. It depends on a set appropriation. There's also a bill by Representative Lance Clow, who for a long time was the Education Committee chair. His bill would include means testing and oversight of recipient schools that was not included in the earlier bill. Finally, there's Jaron Crane has another bill that basically involves smaller vouchers. So that's another one that's still out there. So it's far from a dead issue at this point. That's especially true because the Idaho Launch Program, which is a key program for the governor's agenda, has been stuck in House Education since mid-January. This is the $8,500 grant to new college or high school graduates who want to go to a community college or something like that. You can't eat my buttons. There's a decent chance that this is going to become a bargaining chip in horse trading on this issue. The governor has been reluctant to support any kind of ESA program, but this is also a very large priority for him.
Yeah, and I asked him, he did a breakfast with the Idaho Press Club last week, and I was thinking along the same lines that the Idaho Launch Program was stuck a little bit and just barely escaped the House. And so I asked him point blank, I said, is there any sort of horse trading going on with Idaho Launch and school voucher programs? And he just kind of smiled and looked at me and said, Scott, there's always horse trading going on. So that probably behind the scenes, there's probably a lot of that going on. Just a reminder to our viewers, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. So yeah, I think some of these, and I guess these three bills haven't actually been introduced. This was a hearing, I guess, that Chairwoman Julie Yamamoto had, just to hear them out, hear the proposals out. So they really, I don't know if they've even been assigned an RS. Have they? Or they've just been.
I thought a formal introduction hearing was expected tomorrow, but I'm not 100% on that. There's also a wrinkle today. Today, the House Education Committee was hearing two proposed library bills, but it went over time, and so there was a motion to adjourn before the second bill, which looked like it had some potential to pass, could be voted on. So that'll likely come back up tomorrow, and that could interfere with scheduling. Hard to say, but at some point, I would expect there'll be formal introduction hearings on some or all of these bills.
Yeah, and you predicted this. You said that this bill from Brian Lenny and Tammy Nichols is probably just a trial balloon or just kind of a distraction, and that we likely will see other ESA proposals that are perhaps a little more serious. It was kind of clear from the testimony that Tammy Nichols and Brian Lenny really didn't know what they were talking about. They had a lot of trouble answering very simple questions and specific questions. And so, it became pretty clear that this wasn't going to be a serious proposal. The three that have been now at least talked about from Wendy Horman, and again, you predicted this, Brian, that Lori Den Hartog and Wendy Horman, who have been, talking for a couple of years now about school choice and money following the students. Their bill is similar, but it has strict kind of guardrails. It has income limits, and it has a money limit. I think theirs is $20 million total, and it's like 2,000 students or something like that. That it's very limited. But again, you've got to wonder, because Arizona and Indiana and Wisconsin, they all started small like this. They all started with, it's just $20 million. And I think Indiana is up to $600 million, and Arizona is up to $600 million. And so, you can see that these, again, might be a camel's nose under the tent kind of bills to get the foot in the door and then expand it later on, probably, I would imagine.
That's certainly a possibility, and I expect all of these proposals to be more serious, basically because both Nichols and Lenny belong to a pretty small faction of the legislature, the ones that have near 100% Idaho Freedom Index scores, who just sort of outsourced their will to a third-party organization. But when you've got Horman and Den Hartog, Horman, chair of JFAC, longtime education policy expert, and one time made a bid for House Speaker. She's a veteran. So is Senator Den Hartog. They know how to negotiate a bill and get support behind it. Which does not seem to be something that Nichols and Lenny bothered to do. So I would expect that to be much more serious. Lance Clow's former education chair for quite a long time. So he's a respected voice on these matters. Jaron Crane, even his bill, it comes from a slightly larger faction of the far right coalition that is sort of more closely aligned in voting patterns with people like Mike Moyle. So I would expect that to be more serious as well. So if you're thinking about going to sleep on this issue because the big bill didn't pass, don't do it. The issue's far from dead.
Yeah, and it's entirely conceivable that one of these bills or more or some sort of combination will get through the process and land on Governor Little's desk. So again, it'll be interesting. We kind of talk about this all the time, is whether Governor Little will exercise his veto authority, and whether there would be enough votes to overcome a veto if he does veto it. This is all kind of long down the pipeline, but it's something that we'll be keeping an eye on because Governor Little has said that he does not want to have any sort of voucher program that is diminutive of public education funding. So we'll see where that goes, but we'll be keeping an eye on it. Well, thank you all for joining us again for this edition of Lunch with the Idaho Way. We'll be back next week to talk about a possible constitutional amendment that would make it much harder, some would say impossible, to get a citizens initiative on the ballot. We'll be talking live with Luke Mayville of Reclaim Idaho, which has been successful in getting initiatives on the ballot. In the meantime, please sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, The Idaho Way. The link is below in the comments. Thank you again all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.